everybody. This is Craig of the Pacific War Channel, joined here by my co-host Gaurav. How are you?
Greg, great to be back here and looking forward to switching continents right now for our
Yes.
ongoing series.
Yes, so of course this is Echoes of War. We are also joined here by our guest Simone. How are you?
Hello, thank you for inviting me again. And I'm very excited to go into the battles today.
Yeah. So this is our ongoing series covering the 7 Years' War. We just finished up the French and Indian War, and eventually we'll get to the Indian War, I guess you will call it, later on. But today we're going to be talking again about Europe.
War, but yeah.
Yeah. Before we jump into it, I want to remind everybody that if you haven't already joined us on YouTube, please consider doing so because we put a lot of effort into all of the maps. We're going to be talking about a lot of battles today, so there's a lot of maps to look at, a lot of portraits of key characters we'll be talking about. And I can probably say this for sure. We're going to be found on the Kings and Generals YouTube podcast channel. So you can check us out there. It's we're going through a transition. The Echoes of War podcast video formats typically on the Pacific War channel, but honestly, it seems better to put it on a podcast channel alongside other podcasts I'm part of. So we're in a transition phase. It's going to be over there. And of course, if you'd like to further support us, please consider checking out the YouTube membership or Patreon over at www.patreon.com/Pacific War channel. By joining either of these, you get access to my exclusive podcast series. It's 33 episodes and ongoing. You get early access to all the content I make and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Enough with that shameless plug. Let's just jump right into it. So this is the third episode covering the European theater of this, I think, at this point.
You could consider the second, since the first episode was pretty much a prequel. Could call it that. Let me just bring up a map. So I'll just quickly summarize where we left off last time. I'm just bringing up a map of the participants. So where we left off last time, while as we discussed in our episodes of the French and Indian Wars, fighting has already broken out in North America, and we are at the situation where Frederick had invaded Saxony with the ultimate goal of trying to take over Bohemia from the Habsburg monarchy and just completely disoriented and get rid of the Austrian Empire before he could pivot to deal with the Russians and the French. The British and Hanoverians were supposed to guard his flank. The war did not get off to a good start for him. He faced setbacks. The Austrians fought with greater tenacity than what he was used to experiencing in the past. The Russians had successfully even invaded East Prussia and defeated the Prussians there at the Battle of Gross-Jägersdorf. If I'm not mistaken, they also had like a 3,500 cavalry detachment under General Nadasi, who actually occupied Berlin, which was a big humiliation. But he rallied back with key victories at the Battle of Rosbach and Leuthen, which is where we left. He smashed first French Imperial army, since the rest of the Holy Roman Empire, via the Imperial Diet, had also declared war against him and Hanover. And then he beat at the Battle of Leuthen the Austrian army, which outnumbered him. In both cases, he was outnumbered like 2-1 and still won a resounding one-sided victory. They were pretty important since the Battle of Rosbach, more than anything, it caused King George II to actually break his treaty with the French and Imperials and actually re-enter the war. So that is good, since his port of supply and money and western flank is now secured from the French. The only condition that the King of England had was, please send a competent officer to lead the forces, because my son, the Duke of Cumberland, is an absolute idiot who doesn't know anything. That was pretty much King George's request. And Frederick would send his brother-in-law, the Duke of Brunswick, to take over. Craig, would you just like to speak a little bit of the Duke?
Absolutely. I'm just going to go through my list of 20 people with associated pictures. So the Duke of Brunswick. Okay. And I'm going to share. So we're talking about Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick.
Yep, this is our guy.
Yeah, okay. So Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick, Wolfenbüttel, emerged as one of the most capable Allied commanders in the Seven Years' War, leading a multinational coalition against Frederick the Great. Whoa, one sec, I have a. Oh, sorry, I was getting a weird disclaimer saying that like the quality of our call was going down, but it seems fine. Born into a storied German ducal house, Ferdinand possessed a rare blend of organizational vision, tactical caution, and ability to coordinate diverse forces, Prussian, British, Hanoverian, and other contingents, into a unified field army. Politically adept, he leveraged his status and diplomatic skill to maintain coalition unity in the face of hard fighting, economically stretched adversaries as well. Militarily, he is remembered for being quite measured, methodical in his campaigning, and he emphasized logistics, supply lines, and careful choosing of battlefield ground. His leadership had a stabilizing effect on the Allied war effort during rather difficult years, balancing aggressive action with prudence and often turning initial setbacks into opportunities, though disciplined pursuit was also seen. A distinctive trait of Ferdinand's career was his talent for coalition warfare, keeping desperate elements moving together under a single coherent strategic plan while managing the political sensitivities of all the Allied partners. Keeping it really short and sweet with these little bios because
Sure.
too many characters we're going to be
That's-
talking about in this episode. I have like 10, so yeah.
Yeah, that's a great thing. And there's just two things I'll just add. If people were to call Frederick the Great as the sword of their alliance between Prussia, Hanover, and Britain, he's also considered the shield. He completely would be stymieing the French armies of Louis XV with incredible success. And it's kind of funny because Simone only mentioned this to me. Uh, Frederick was married to the Duke's wife, and he absolutely hated her. He's like, I don't want to be seeing your face unless it's at like a public event.
Jesus.
But but he adored him because the Duke had also served with him. Though formally, when taking command of the Hanoverian front, he's technically subordinated to King George II, but Frederick would still be treating him like, yeah, you're my officer. You need to do as I say and what I say, etc. But, the Duke shrugged it off, as you mentioned, right? He kind of gets the different elements and political sensitivities to work together, unlike the typical French and imperial armies, which never work on that front. So I think after the Battle of Leuthen, one of the key things that just came out of one second, just bring up the map of Europe, was Leuthen happened in December of 1757. They go into their winter quarters, and both sides are horribly screwed by the winter. There is disease that actually causes the Prussians to lose as many casualties as they lost in combat and desertions to this winter sickness. And the Austrians also suffered equally bad because before the Battle of Leuthen, they had like 90,000 soldiers in Bohemia, and come to the turn of 1758, their army's down to a third of its size. And despite this, the Habsburg monarchy is still very much anti-Frederick, and this is led by Maria Theresa and Count Canitz, who are basically anyone who just says like, we should not be fighting so aggressively, we should want to consider making peace. They pretty much get shat upon by these two figures in court, and they make the necessary decision and probably overdue decision of removing Prince Charles of Lorraine from supreme command of the Habsburg forces. And this also had the unintended effect of one of their most successful cavalry commanders, General Nadasti, and equal to General von Seydlitz and Zieten, you could say, to resign his commission in disgust on like imperial politics taking its toll. And we have a fairly competent officer now taking place. Field Marshal Daun takes over the command. Correct? Maybe you'd like to talk about this competent but ultra cautious commander briefly, since he's going to be playing a big role in the upcoming battles.
Yeah, here, I'm just going to bring up a portrait of him. So, Leopold Joseph von Daun, was a towering Austrian field marshal whose strategic patience and steady command were decisive in several campaigns throughout the Seven Years' War. He was born into the Habsburg military tradition. Daun developed a reputation for cautious but effective operations, using fortified positions and well-chosen deployments to blunt Prussian offensives. Politically, he embodied the Habsburg approach to wartime leadership, seasoned risk awareness, and deeply engaged in coordination of multinational imperial forces across the empire's very diverse frontiers. Universally recognized for his ability to manage attrition and to convert tactical pauses into strategical gains, Daun's hallmark was restraint, married to precision. He often preferred fortified lines, attritional warfare, and the slow eroding of an opponent's resources rather than reckless frontal assaults.
Actually, pretty short and sweet. Thank you about that.
I'm trying to do my best because
Yeah,
when you
yeah,
gave me
I
the
know.
list and I was like, wow, this is a lot of people. I'm like, yeah, okay.
That's true, but to be fair, last time we did not have the time to even speak about anybody.
Yeah.
But yes, as you mentioned, while methodical, military-minded, and has some sense, as we'll discuss a certain battle that's going to be coming up this year, he is very cautious, very, very cautious. And I think Simone had a more a more descriptive explanation, but I think we'll get to that when we need to get there.
We talking like Montgomery level cautious? Like, gotta get all your ducks in order before we engage?
I would say even
bit
more
more than
cautious.
Okay.
Yeah, more than that. Like, he is competent, like, we have to give him that, but when you need to be decisive, well, that was a bit lacking, to say the least. But he does start to rebuild the Austrian army after, like, that horrible winter, all right? And he gets them into a fully functional force. And Frederick initially was at the Bohemian Silesian border. The reason being he wanted to focus on the Austrians now because he believed that the Russians are gone for good. Because surprisingly, after the Battle of Gross-Jägersdorf, the Russians, who probably did not plan to invade that deep into Western European territory, you could say, and with the supply lines completely stretched, had their field marshal withdrew. And Empress Elizabeth was not too pleased and she had him court-martialed. The Russians would now be re-entering the war this year again with a massive army of almost 80 to 100,000 soldiers under a new commander. Yep, wow. That's a very good description.
Yeah.
So there are already two armies that are marshalling against Frederick directly that are numbering over 100,000 each.
If I was someone who knew nothing about the 7 Years' War, I would be very confused looking at a map and seeing the numbers as to how Prussia and Britain, how they can possibly hope to survive this.
Yeah, I think it's just better I just get back to that map first.
Yeah,
Oh God. So do bear with me, audience. One of the biggest problems we had to figure out is how do we navigate the tabs. I have like so many open. But yes. So you could say Frederick is here in the border of Silesia and Saxony right now. Brunswick is in Hanover over here, and the French and the Imperial Army tend to be like the northern, what we call northern Germany and the Dutch Republic here, because that's where their focus of the war is. The Russians have entered into from Poland, Lithuania, and will be marching into East Prussia. And the Swedes, who have come opportunistically, they are not really important in the grand scheme of the war because the battles with the Swedes are really small in number and in troop count. The reason the Russians, if someone also asks why was Russia allowed to march its armies through Poland, Lithuania, the answer is actually very simple. The Elector of Saxony is also the king of Poland, Lithuania, and he was definitely not happy that Frederick took over his state. And yeah, so that is the situation with Frederick right now. So you have like 100,000 army. The Swedes have sent a few thousand troops. You have 100,000 here plus, and the Habsburg have a big recruiting grounds. And the French also have a fairly similar number of troops marshalling here with the imperial forces. Now, we go to the Russians are going to be invading. So what Frederick is doing right now is going to be a twofold strategy before he has to react to the Russians. So he doesn't know the Russians are advancing yet. What he indicates to the Duke of Brunswick, who's now taken over at Hanover, is drive the French armies away to kind of secure the western flank for me. And he is going to invade into Moravia, which is like just this northeastern part where my cursor is hovering of the Habsburg monarchy. He wants to take over the fortress of Olmütz, which is a key fortress city that he needs to take over. And the idea is if he can get the city, great. Or if not, it'll force Field Marshal Daun's army, which is closer to the Saxon border, to now come and fight him in battle, which is his ultimate goal. However, he really mistimes his advance. He reaches Olmütz in May of 1758, since he did require time to rebuild his army as well, which was affected by plague and disease and everything. But the Austrians have reinforced the defenses. It's a garrison of 9,000 soldiers with 300 plus cannons. They are well stocked with provisions. Now, as the Prussians, which are now who will be conducting the siege under Field Marshal Keith, are doing, Frederick is trying to secure, bring his supplies over, and that is to be done by one large convoy that's heading its way. Because the king did not want to send isolated convoys. He felt like that'll be too easy pickings for the Austrians.
Which was also, that was pretty much a fact that one small one wouldn't work because they keep trying to do it, but they keep getting ambushed because the Austrians had irregulars everywhere.
Yeah. So, well, I'm going to get to the map of the upcoming battle shortly, but at the fortress of Olmütz, what would happen actually is the Austrians are coming in from the west towards the east. So they're coming in here from the Saxon border to kind of like, the Silesian border, you could say. And the regulars are screening off Frederick's reconnaissance. So he does not know that they are aware of his big convoy that is about to turn up. And this is going to be a massive convoy that's heading its way. So this is literally a convoy that's going to have 4,000 plus wagons of supplies. And it's going to be fairly well defended because the king wants over, 10,000 to 11,000 troops guarding it. Now I'm just going to share it to the new map. So we have the Battle of Simone, correct me if I mispronounce it, Domstad, that is about to take place, which is this supply mission. In terms of numbers, it's not a big battle, but in terms of significance, it's really big. And Field Marshal Daun is not involved in this battle. He sends two of his subordinates, General Laudon and General Siskovitis. Craig, would you also like to just talk about General Laudon? I do have his portrait as well, so I'll just bring it up.
Oh, sure.
He's going to be one of the biggest adversaries of Frederick the Great. You could just continue. Just found one of his images.
I can bring up the portrait, actually. You got it?
Yep.
Oh, cool. Erzgedon von Laudon was a master of operational warfare in the Austrian army, renowned for his adaptability, logistics management, and aggressive offensives against the Prussians and other allied forces while opportunities had opened themselves. Laudon's career bridged traditional Habsburg approaches with modern warfare at the time, as he shifted between theaters from Bohemia to Silesia and beyond, seeking advantageous ground and well-tighted supply lines. Politically, Laudon embodied the pragmatic Austrian leadership that valued experience, technical competence, and a willingness to take calculated risks under the constraints of imperial politics and court priorities. A distinction A distinctive trait of Laudon's command was his capacity to balance audacious action with disciplined administration. He could mount rapid, forceful blows when the moment demanded, yet always anchored his operations in logistical feasibility. So it seems he has two pretty good traits there.
Yeah, and what's especially good in this dynamic is that compared to his superior officer, he, as you mentioned, he is very active, and in this aspect can sort of mitigate the cautious nature of Daun.
Yeah. So just bringing back the map. So you can imagine that this convoy is coming down from Silesia, heading south to the fortress of Olmütz, and it's a pretty big convoy, as I mentioned, right? We are talking about 4,000-ish wagons of supplies, 2,500 cattle, and they're protected by almost 11,000 soldiers, including one of Frederick's favorite commanders, General Zieten. We'll get to his portrait and all a bit later, but this is the importance that he has. Now, Laudon does not have supreme command. He is sharing the command with two others. So, initially, his companion, General Siskovitis, is lost. Like, he takes time to approach the main area, and Laudon just attacks here in the first village, right? Just as the Prussians had, just crossed this river here from this village of Gettysburg. And Laudon had already positioned his hussars and artillery on these hilltops around the main road. So they are in a perfect ambush position. But given the fact that he was outnumbered, it becomes a stalemate. He's unable to break through, but the Prussians are unable to also break through. So he orders a retreat. Then this leads to the arrival of General Zieten. And what the Prussians do is they spend hours repairing all the damage and reorganizing their supply column. Now, Laudon moves to the village of Barn that you see over here. He kind of retreats towards the north of the road, whereas General Sivoskis, sorry, can't pronounce his name, apologies, has now arrived and around the village of Nuremberg here has positioned his forces in ambush. This is like a really hilly area, a lot of mountains, so it's pretty easy to get lost. Now, because of Laudon's attack, the Prussians are expecting trouble. But what they do is they become very front heavy. Half of the Prussian force is now put at the vanguard because they expect somewhere as they move along this track, they're going to be forced into battle and they need to be prepared. And this is where the Austrians show pretty good cunning, because as the convoy was moving down, the General Siskovitis, he let the entire vanguard through. The vanguard, as I mentioned, almost 50% of the soldiers and only 250 or so of the 400 supply wagons. He literally lets them pass the village of Domstad because they're not his target. He's going for the main body, which is now going to be thinly defended. The vanguard has been completely cut out. He launches his attack here, as you can see from the village of Nuremberg, moving north and engages the Prussian infantry that is guarding the main bag of the main convoy body. And keep in mind, folks, with 4,000 wagons, this is actually a convoy that stretches several dozen kilometers, it says. I think I read 45 kilometers, so it's supposed to be this entire convoy end to end. It's pretty big. And around the same time, General Laudon also decides to attack from the north. So you're catching them in a proper pincer. And that's it. That was the battle. Zieten could not hold back, and the Prussians, being pressed from two fronts, began to crumble. And this battle would be a pretty big victory for the Austrians, because, as I said, in terms of troops, it was 12,000 Austrians and around 10,000 Prussians. The Prussians had about 3,000 casualties, between 2,500 to 3,000, but the Austrians only suffered 700 casualties. The biggest loss for Frederick was the supplies. A lot of the wagons had heavy gun and a lot of artillery ammunition that he would be needing for his siege of the fortress city of Olmütz, which now he definitely cannot besiege. And this would cause him to make a retreat, because while 250 wagons did leave with the vanguard, only 100 of them reached. And it's around this time, because this battle takes place in towards the end of June in 1758, and he's now gotten word that the Russians have arrived and they've gone past East Prussia. Simone, is there anything else you'd like to add about this battle?
I mean, you pretty much covered all of it. And as you said, this is just, it makes his position untenable. And he just cannot take the fortress anymore.
And this was actually Frederick's thinking before this entire campaign, which he would write to his younger brother, Prince Henry. He says, if I march straight on Olmütz, the enemy will come to defend it. Then we shall have a battle in terrain not of his choice. If I beat him, as it must be hoped, I shall besiege Olmütz, and then the enemy, forced to cover Vienna, will move all his forces in that direction, and Olmütz taken. Then your Henry, referring to Henry's army, will be assigned to take Prague and hold Bohemia in respect. After which, let the Russians or whoever come, I shall be able to make the necessary detachment. Now, this was honestly Frederick's grand strategy before the battle, but, well, the Austrians decided that, Frederick, your supplies are ours, and he would withdraw. Now, concurrently, we will switch fronts now. I need to talk about the Hanoverian front, where there is a big reversal thanks to a competent general now leading the Hanoverian forces. So, as we mentioned, the Duke of Brunswick has taken over the command, and what he needs to do is drive away. He was ordered by Frederick, keyword ordered, to take away the entire French army and secure area, so that they are not going to be a threat to the western flank. And this is going to be in conjunction with Prince Henry's army, and this leads to the Battle of Crefeld, which I'm going to just bring up a map for. Okay, I have the map. I just need to find it on the tab.
Poor audio listeners continuously
I'm so
hear
sorry.
about the problems with our tabs.
Yeah. This is like a nightmare, these tabs. But as you mentioned, when the Duke of Brunswick did take over the armies, right? He rebuilt this coalition allied army. So I'm going to refer to the Duke's army as the allied army, since it's a combination of Prussian, Hanoverian, and British troops as well. So anytime we are in the Hanoverian theater and it's an allied army, please note that I'm talking about, the Duke of Brunswick and his forces, because primarily he's only going to be facing the French. Now, he launches a series of attacks, which was called the Allied Spring Offensive of 1758, and I know, right? But it is kind of going in the direction we're not used to from World War II.
Yeah, I was gonna say for the Germans, they're like, oh wow, we get allied beside our name for once. This is interesting.
That's a good one. But the French army was around 50,000 strong. It was led by the Count of Louis de Bourbon, who was the commander here. He was a count of something. I completely forgot that because I just remembered it now. But
a count of something. That's a pretty good description.
I'm so sorry. God, I just remembered reading his title, and in all my notes I referred to him as the Count, and then here I am with a complete brain fart. But the Count of Clermont. I'm so sorry, but he is the Count of Clermont. Louis de Bourbon. He gets pushed back, so they literally cross the Rhine, because while the Duke of Brunswick launches his own attacks, Prince Henry also launches his attacks into Germany on behalf of his older brother. This actually causes the Count to believe that he's facing like Frederick himself with a massive army of 90 to 100,000 men, since it's a two-pronged assault. They end up crossing the river. And do I have any other images of the region? Unfortunately, they're not that detailed. But they cross the river Rhine and they camp. And both sides know that a battle is imminent. And the French are right now, as you can see, they are positioned. They are the red in this map here. The right-hand side is actually their infantry predominantly. Around 60% of their infantry is in this region. And they also have around 6,000, 7,000 soldiers guarding the city of Düsseldorf as well. But they do not play a part in this battle. They have at the village of Anath here, there was supposed to be like a garrison of about 400 men. And in the settlements of St. Tonis and Crefeld over here, they had again posted picket garrisons of a few companies each. So between these three villages, you are deploying 15 to 1600 soldiers in total. The cavalry is the main reserve, and they are positioned at the kind of like at the rear center. And the problem with the Count of Clermont is he believes his way of battle and his thinking is exactly what the Duke, like Brunswick, is going to do. So it's kind of like how our friends in the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army believed everything should go.
Yes.
He believed that they will not attack his center because he had already positioned his cannons across the length of the front. And he said that is suicidal. So for Brunswick is going to attack him on my right flank, which is why he had positioned all his forces on the right. I guess the logic was they were fairly close to the river, so it is supposed to prevent at least one flank from being safe from outflanking. The problem is Prince Ferdinand, the Duke of Brunswick, has other ideas. When his forces come down, he has a subordinate take Crefeld here, and he also takes the village of St. Tonis. And what he does is similar to what Frederick did at Leuthen. He kept 6 infantry battalions from St. Tonis here and most of his artillery, and had them openly deployed to make a demonstration. And that started a long artillery duel between the two forces. He actually, well, it's not visible on this map because there was a wide outflanking move he would do on the French left. And he was to turn around and form up from this village of Anath that we can see at the bottom left of this map, and then smash the French from the flank. Even when that artillery duel that came place, even after the French noticed that the advance guard had reached Anath and had driven back their picket detachment that was there, the Count of Clermont, he was completely convinced that nothing is going to happen on that flank. It's just a diversionary force. And in fact, ordered several infantry battalions in the reserve to move to the right flank still. The area where the Duke of Brunswick has absolutely no intention of attacking. Once the Duke's army forms up on the French left, his son leads the attack and completely smashes through the French lines initially. And this is where the French officers at least show some degree of competency, unlike the commander, where the center forces kind of turn back inwards to now face the allied Hanoverian German Prussian armies that are now attacking their flank. And the cavalry is actually moving behind to kind of come up between these two hills that you can see here. Again, this is described to be supposedly an inhospitable place. Now, I don't know, these guys probably have never seen the tundras of Siberia or the Sahara Desert to ever consider the word inhospitable, but I digress. And now, finally, the Count of Clermont has woken up, and he is also sending in his forces to support the left flank. So you have his army's infantry columns lines here that are turning and marching in column to the left. Because as you mentioned, Craig, in our first episode of Europe, marching in column is the fastest way to go. And they still will have to deploy into battle. The Hanoverian Prussian, the Allied armies here, they are already in line formation. So they have the advantage. And as they are marching, two things happen. Well, three important things happen. For some unknown reason, his Brunswick's general at Crefeld just withdraws his forces, probably believing that they were lost. But as you see, this happens so many times where local commanders take their own initiative, but it does not really affect anything. And the Allied cavalry then charges and initially causes some mayhem to the infantry before the French cavalry that are kind of on the right flank as well. They charge in to kind of stabilize the line. The infantry also move into support, and the French infantry, which have now making a hard march and are getting exhausted, crossing this kind of marshy-ish ground as it's supposed to be described, they are completely flanked by the central 6 battalions that he had left here for the demonstration. Those guys just smash into the French lines. There's pretty fierce fighting for a few hours before the French start to break. You see infantry battalions slowly start to withdraw, and that's where the Count of Clermont, probably making a very strategic decision, withdraws his forces. His last reserves, which were the grenadiers, were actually used to form a kind of line to allow the rest of the army to pursue, like to retreat in good order. The Duke does not pursue that anymore. But it was a pretty good victory because with 32,000 men, the Duke of Brunswick and his forces suffered about 2,000 casualties. But they inflicted almost 6,000 casualties on a near 50,000 strong army. And the French army are now just going to be in a full retreat for now. But he's then ordered to withdraw back because Frederick had said, he just wants to knock the French off balance so that the flank is secure and doesn't want to overextend his supplies, which actually does make sense because now we are going to be talking about the Russians. And Simone, would you like to talk about the build up to this pretty decisive battle that's about to take place?
Yeah, I can do that.
Need to find the right map for you, but maybe you could just set the context of the Russian advance.
Yeah, as you already alluded previously, Russians, after the previous battles, retreated into their quarters and to resupply and establish more secure supply lines, which they finally managed, and they once again moved into East Prussia and mostly captured it for the most part, and then decided to move on further in. Now, at first, Frederick didn't really realize that the Russians were on the move. He previously still thought that he was going to fight the Austrians first, but when he got the information that the Russians were actually invading his core territory, he quickly decided that those were the bigger threat than the Austrians and really force-marched his troops to the north in order for him to be able to fight them. This actually somewhat took the Russians by surprise because they knew that he was focusing on the Austrians, and the speed at which he was moving was just incredible. It's just they managed to actually put in the distance from Silesia to Prussia to the north in, I think it was 7 days, which is an insane distance.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. So the Russians are now led by a different general. as you can imagine, because Empress Elizabeth was really pissed off, and they're led by General William Fermor. And he had the task to either invade the lands of Brandenburg itself, so Frederick's core home territory, or Silesia. Both are prizes he cannot afford not to defend. As so, he actually was first attacking the fortress of Kustrin, which is slightly east of Berlin. So that's how close he's getting to Berlin. Kustrin is defended by about 26,000 troops. Frederick, meanwhile, because after the debacle at Battle of Domstad and where he had to lift the siege of Olmütz, he withdraws back into Silesia, and hearing the news of the Russian advance, this happened concurrently. He marches with only 11,000 soldiers up north. And as Simone mentioned, they marched 200 plus kilometers in 7 days. But that was enough to alleviate the pressure on the fortress, and William Fermor withdrew the Russian forces. And this is when the Prussians decided to move on the attack, and that's where this Battle of Zorndorf takes place. So initially, while it's not visible on this particular map, the Mietzell River that you guys see and the Quatschen, these are all tributaries of the Oder River, and Frederick was initially camped to the north. And since they're right by the rivers, it's like a lot of marshy land and everything. Initially, Fermor had actually positioned his troops facing northwards, thinking Frederick is going to attempt a direct crossing. And he also guessed that Frederick might try to cross back and attack from the southwest. So he had actually detached a pretty strong force of about 10 to 11,000 soldiers to block the southwest. So they don't participate in this particular path. Frederick, on the other hand, as you can just see at the corners of the map, actually marches northwards, then goes east, and then turns back south, which is not the intended route, but he's now completely cut off the Russian line of supply. This is where I believe Frederick made one of his biggest blunders, or I won't call it a blunder, but yeah, actually it is. At the village of Wilkersdorf that you see here, the entire Russian baggage train was there. Yeah, the Russians, since they actually imagined Frederick will not be attacking from the eastern side, they had kept their entire baggage train here. He could have just simply captured it and withdrawn, and the Russian army would disintegrate on its own. He did not, because he had a pretty poor opinion at this point of the Russians, and he was too stubborn, and he wanted to have the military victory, which honestly, this was just a really stupid decision by Frederick. There's nothing else to say. And he forms up into the battle like in front of the village of Zorndorf, as we can see over here. And over here, the Steinbusch here, it kind of is going to be a central demarcation. The Russians also are aware of his movements. So William Fermor has made his army just pretty much turn backwards in a 180-degree arc, so that instead of facing northwards, they're now facing southwards. The Prussians decide to attack in a staggered formation on the left. So this is the unit that is in question that is going to be moving forward first. The infantry on the right do not move forward. Their intention is to keep their half of the Russian army focused on them, so that they are not able to go and intercept that half of the Prussian army that is moving forward. And at the start of this battle, he is outnumbered, because there are an estimated 45 to 50,000 Russians, and he has between 33 to 36,000 Prussians. Frederick is aggressive. He only believes in attack, not defense. And when he attacks, it's at 11 a.m. when the infantry are moving forward. And we also have General Seydlitz, one of his key cavalry commanders. He's commanding 36 squadrons of cavalry on this far left across this the Zabengrund. Now, what happens is actually confusion that one of the Prussian guns actually blow up an Russian ammo wagon. It causes that entire, like that big smoke and everything. But with the direction of the wind, it actually gave more favor to the Russians. The Prussians were completely disoriented with the smoke and haze that was now coming their way. That instead of maintaining a staggered, focused attack on their left flank, some of their infantry battalions became isolated. And after crossing the Steinbusch, a gap developed between the two lines. And the Russian cavalry that you see here just said thank you very much and just charged and completely routed the Prussian infantry on the left. The cavalry here comes, and Frederick did give desperate orders for von Seydlitz to attack.
Hey guys, this is Craig from the Pacific War Channel. Please don't forget to check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account over at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where you can join the ranks and gain access to a hell of a lot of goodies. At the base minimum, you get access to the exclusive monthly podcast, early access to all of my content, voting rights for what subjects I will tackle next, and at higher tiers, I have much more goodies to come. So please click that link and check it out.
Von Seydlitz actually refused. He said, if after the battle the king can have my head if he wants to, but until then I'm going to move and deploy as I see fit. So he is not at all moving to engage. It's absolute carnage. One of the most iconic images of Frederick the Great is here, where he's part of one of the central infantry battalions, and he picks up a standard and personally leads his soldiers into battle. This is that famous image that was painted later showing the king leading the Prussians into battle. But it is carnage that's going on. And this is when the Prussian infantry on the right, whose initial job was to just stay put and just bringing up the map again, who stay put and lock down the Russian left, they start making their attack. The Russian cavalry on the flank have now also attacked these guys, so the Prussian army is completely engaged. This is actually when General Seydlitz launches his own attack, because he realizes there's no way the Russians can reinforce against his attack. And in a single devastating charge, he completely destroys the Russian right flank over here. They dissolve completely. It is absolute carnage. There's no sense of discipline. Half the Russians actually run back and start looting their own camp instead of just fleeing. Some soldiers actually are reported to just go to the looting the camp and just start drinking alcohol. I guess the vodka is pretty important to prevent it from getting into Prussian hands, I guess.
I mean, if you're gonna die, dying drunk is better than not.
Yeah.
True. But there were incidents of Russian units also standing their ground. And with, both sides not pressing each other, the battle ended, you could call it. Like, the battle's over. A brawl has now broken out. And these guys are fighting for hours. It's until 9 p.m. Most units don't have ammunition by the evening. It is only hand-to-hand bayonet combat that's taking place between the infantry. So it's gruesome and brutal. Around 9 p.m., Frederick sounds the retreat to Wilkersdorf, since he realized that he has absolutely no command of his army whatsoever. And William Farmer has also done the same with the Russian army. And it is a pretty costly victory. It's estimated that the Prussians lost around 13,000 of their soldiers, which represented about 35% of their army. The Russians also suffered pretty heavily. 45% of their army was casualties. They took almost 20% 20,000 casualties. Question is, it's considered an inconclusive battle. It is not considered a victory. because Frederick kind of exaggerated his success. But, Firmer just said, this is not a victory for us, though it is pretty widely celebrated across Europe. And since the Russians would withdraw for the time being, since Frederick does kind of keep the battlefield, it is, I guess you could call it a success of some sorts for him.
I mean, the one thing it mainly does is that it forces the Russians out again and gives them a bit more time to focus on the Austrians again, which strategically for him is one of the most important results he can get.
And the reason the battle also broke down was it was expected Field Marshal Daun was to send in Austrian soldiers to support the Russians. They never came. And the Austrian envoy who was in Firmer's camp, would publicly criticize the general's capabilities as in battle. So it's not a really great relationship that the Austrians and Russians have beyond the hatred for Frederick. They have nothing, there's no way you could ever see them being firm allies. But it is actually after this battle, Frederick is he says like two things. One, he says of all our enemies, the Austrians understand war the best. The French are the weakest. So I think that's Simone that makes you feel very happy. And I think Greg, we anyways like to make fun of France.
As they should be made fun of.
Yeah. And he says the Russians are the most savage. And it's after this battle also of Zorndorf, he says it's easier to kill the Russians than to win over them. And a British envoy in the Prussian camp also supposed to have said the Russians fight like devils incarnate. I guess maybe that's vodka power for you guys. But the reason Field Marshal Daun did not send in any troops was he was massing for his own attack. And this is going to be a pretty costly battle for Frederick. Simone. I'm sorry, guys. Simone has a gaming name, so that's why that inadvertently stuck out that I called him a stick, because that's his name there. But after this battle, we just have like two quick things that I'll just mention. We have the Battle of Torgau, which was between Prussia and Sweden. As I said, Sweden's not really important in the war. They just come opportunistic. The size of forces are small. And in the Battle of Torgau, they hold back the Prussian commanders 6 charges against their position, with the Prussians losing about 153 men and the Swedes losing 160 men. And after that, the Prussians kind of withdraw from that. And then you also have the Battle of Fehrbellin, which was again a Prussian attack against a Swedish entrenchment. The Swedes have around 2,000 men and they successfully hold off a 6,000 strong Prussian advance. We don't know how many the Prussians lost, but it wasn't significant, but they did not take the position. And it was estimated that the Swedes lost about 400 men. Greg, did you get anything about General Seydlitz? Or would you like me to speak about him?
Yeah, one sec. I'm just going to find him.
Yeah, I think I'd just like to get him out and then Zieten, because next will be a pretty decisive and important battle.
You able to see the picture?
Yep.
So it's Friedrich Wilhelm von Seydlitz was the guy you're talking about?
Yep, this is the man.
Just to make sure. So he stands out as the most...
there's Zieten as well, so Frederick had two pretty good cavalry commanders, yeah.
He stands out as the most celebrated Prussian cavalry commander of the era. As far as my notes go when I was researching this, he was celebrated for being quite bold, aggressive, and technically superb at horsemanship. And of course, he served under Frederick the Great. Seydlitz's career fused spectacular battlefield leadership with a keen sense of practicalities of mounted warfare, maneuver, tempo, and decisive use of cavalry to disrupt enemy lines, exploit gaps, and protect the army's flanks. His cavalry charges became legendary for their audacity, tempo, and shock value, and his innovations in drill, reconnaissance, and charging formations helped shape Prussian cavalry doctrine for generations. Politically, Seydlitz represented the aristocratic officer who earned trust through demonstrated bravery, reliability, and relentless work ethic. His unique traits included an almost instinctual feel for battlefield geometry, knowing when to press home a charge and when to spare wary mounts for a later maneuver.
As Simone had mentioned in the previous episode of the European theatre, remember this name. He was the one who led the decisive charges at Rosepark and Leuthen as well. So he definitely is one of the most. And as you mentioned, he helped develop the Prussian cavalry arm, which was otherwise just a reconnaissance unit. He started building this up to that they are now actually a competent unit for Frederick to rely on in the battle. So that's actually, I guess, to his credit as well. But yeah, I think that's it about Seydlitz, and we now have to continue the war of Daun's preparations for a major battle. Simone, would you like to take us into the build-up of this engagement?
Yeah, let me quickly.
I'm just trying to find the maps.
I actually do not have that many notes on that battle in particular. I don't know why.
All right. That's fine. I'll take over. So, as I mentioned, one of the biggest things that of the disagreement was the Austrians never sent help because they were planning for their own attack into Saxony. And in August of 1758, while Frederick was marching north and then subsequently engaging the Russians at Zorndorf. Keep in mind, the Battle of Zorndorf happens towards the end of August. Prince Henry reports that who's holding Saxony, which is 20,000 soldiers, reports that 80,000 Austrian soldiers under Field Marshal Daun have now invaded my realm. He has, there's no way he can resist that. And Frederick, once again, after the Battle of Zorndorf, he force marches his troops down into Saxony. They march another 180 kilometers, literally a day or two after the Battle of Zorndorf. 180 kilometers is covered in just a week. But that pace did cost him a few thousand soldiers who dropped out as casualties since everyone has their limits of endurance.
Yeah, and if you just march this distance in such a short time, the chances for you breaking bones, not because you trip or just because you are exhausted, is very high. There's a reason why oftentimes these kind of things do not happen in the modern day.
Yeah, and so as we mentioned, Daun had initially positioned himself east of Dresden, the capital of Saxony, but Frederick managed to slip through and reinforce the armies there, and some reinforcements did also arrive, so that he, Field Marshal Keith, General von Zieten, all have amassed a force. We have this game of cat and mouse that is taking place between the two forces because Daun is trying to lure him and bait him, but Frederick is just shadowing Daun's army, even though he's outnumbered like over 2 to 1. And Daun is now under heavy pressure from the imperial court of the Habsburgs to fight because, well, Daun does not believe in fighting unless he's absolutely sure. As you said, just think of Montgomery's planning on steroids. But with reaching this kind of position in Saxony in October, he starts camping out. So Frederick also enters, and as we can see on this map, let me see if I can zoom in a bit. Did it zoom in for you guys? Because it's not showing on my end. All right. So the Prussians are encamped, and this area, while it's not a really great scale, all these orange bits that you can see on the map, all these orange blobs, they represent pretty dominating hilly features and forests. Frederick is kind of around the village of Pomwitz and Rodentwitz, and he is commanding what you could call the left flank. He had sent one of his generals with about 6,000 soldiers to kind of be the far left flank of his army, and they are not unfortunately going to be fighting in this particular engagement. Daun is kind of camped initially over here, as you can see, like well away from the Prussians. Frederick kind of is lax. He is like pretty confident about victory. He's confident in his troops. He's confident in aggression. Whereas Field Marshal Keith, one of his best field commanders, General Zieten and General von Seydlitz, his two best cavalry commanders, they are not at all happy with the position that they camped in. They think that they need to withdraw to a better position, and Frederick overrules it, and they are and he orders them to wait here because he wants to resupply his army, which on the face of it makes sense. And this was a decision that was made on the 10th of October 1758. And meanwhile, Laudon was urging Field Marshal Daun, his commanding officer, that please attack. We are in a good position. And Craig, because you are going to be completely having no idea about this, tell me, how long did Daun take to make the decision to attack? Considering he's outnumbered, the Prussians have no idea where they are.
Yeah, and he's practically surrounding them already. So 2 days decision making.
Fairly close. He took 3 whole days.
Okay.
So how the Austrians are going to be divided is you have the Duke of Arenberg over here, who is going to be commanding about 20,000 infantry on what you can call their eastern flank of the Austrian advance. Then you had the generals O'Donnell, who is going to be commanding a cavalry detachment which is supposed to cover the extreme west. So it's around this area. So this is all General O'Donnell's forces, but it's predominantly a cavalry unit. It's not a mixed unit like what Loudon and Daun, who will be commanding the two largest contingents, with Loudon taking the southwest area, which would be around here, and these forces would be under Daun themselves. And to compound errors for that, Frederick actually ordered his men that except for like pickets, no one needs to, the soldiers can sleep. The cavalry can unsaddle their horses and let the horses graze. You can imagine what's about to happen. Though, to their credit, the 3 commanders I mentioned, they disobeyed the orders. They tried to keep their men in a better state of alert, but they could not do too much. The Austrians, from their positions towards the east, moved under the cover of darkness, and they launched their attacks focusing on the village of Hochkirch at 4 a.m. on the 14th of October 1758. It's when the pickets of the Prussians are overrun, or Prussian guns over, like, start an artillery duel, but Austrian grenadiers, quickly silence the guns. And after that, chaos erupts. So this area of Hochkirch is technically considered the Prussian right flank. Units are not in order. They're still trying to form up and just get into some cohesion. And then you have Loudon's and Daun's troops moving in a coordinated assault onto the village. There are individual instances of Prussian line battalions, cavalry squadrons, etc., all fighting with great valor and combat. They make the enemy pay heavily. But what is one battalion when you're being attacked by 10 to 20 battalions with heavy guns? It's complete carnage. And soldiers began to retreat up to the north where the Prussian left flank is. And Frederick the Great is sleeping. He does not want to be disturbed. He's literally thinking that the sounds of battle are just, skirmishes taking place. It is only when some cannonballs actually hit near his area that's when he's finally roused into action. And in the meantime, the three generals, Keith, Seydlitz, and Zieten, are just doing whatever the hell they can to just try to stem the Austrian advance. And concurrently, the Duke of Arenberg's 20,000 have also begun to attack around the village of Nieten, where there is a small elevated position held by a few Prussian battalions and some artillery. But for now, they are able to hold off the larger Austrian force with relative ease. And when Frederick finally wakes up, he quickly springs into action. Some reserve regiments that were available with his left flank were immediately sent to the south to bolster his right. He quickly ordered for one of his generals, General Redzov, who I mentioned. He sent him to the far left. So they are not on this map, but they were supposed to be around the village of Vaika or so, to come back, and they are to now guard the line of retreat because he knows that he has to withdraw his forces in good order and needs a unit ready to engage. And he finally moves down to try to, secure the retreat. And it's at this time disaster for the Prussians and Frederick personally takes place. Field Marshal Keith leads a column into the village of Hochkirch because he wants to withdraw some of the heavy Prussian guns. And he is fatally shot and then blown up by a cannonball. And one of Frederick's best friends and best commanders is now lying dead in the village of Hochkirch. Seydlitz and Zieten are doing whatever the hell they can to, secure the flank and just prevent an absolute rout. General Redzov's corps has now come, and they are kind of positioned to the north of this settlement of Rodewitz or so that the line of retreat is now open for them. And the Prussians then began their withdrawal. General O'Donnell was actually supposed to engage Redzov's corps as it came, but either we don't know whether he engaged and fled or just did not engage at all. But it allowed us unit of Prussians to be unmolested and ready for combat. And to the credit, the Prussian infantry did withdraw in very good order. Moment they left the village of Hochkirch, it was no longer a rout. They were retreating. The panic subsided. They were showing that iron discipline that the Prussians were always famous for. But this was a complete disaster for Frederick. He walked into the trap and blundered. He lost all between 9,000 to 10,000 men of his 33 to 36,000 strong army at this battle. Many of them at Hochkirch, which was the scene of such bloody fighting. One of the streets was actually called Blood Street with the river of blood that formed. Regardless, you could also say that the Austrians took a beating as well. They still had about 6,000 casualties, which, considering their numerical, artillery, and surprise elements, I see they paid a bigger price than they should have. But as usual, because Field Marshal Daun is in command, they don't really make an active pursuit of the retreating Prussians. But it was a huge, huge blow, losing Field Marshal Keith. And another loss for Frederick was and the son of the old Dessau, his son, von Dessau, was also injured, and he would never recover. He would actually die in 1760 when released from captivity from the Austrians. So he lost two good friends. And another major personal blow was his older sister, Wilhelmina, also died of natural causes around this time. So literally a few days after this battle, he gets the news that his sister, which is his closest confidant and his biggest cheerleader, you could say, she died. It's a massive blow for the man. And it was actually said that he showed his librarian a small box of 18 opium capsules that he could just use to kind of journey to a dark place. This was the state of Frederick the Great as the year 1758 came to an end. At the same time, France also gets reinvigorated. They do get a new prime minister who wants to now have the great idea of invading both Hanover and Britain at the same time. Yeah, Craig, your expression is pretty valid because that's
some dumb moves there. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think we'll continue on this side of the front, and Simone, maybe you'd want to bring us into the and explain the Battle of Kunersdorf, like in the events that led up to it, because that's the next major engagement that takes place.
Yeah. So after this battle with the Austrians, the Russians actually once again make a move and move into Frederick's core territory once again. Now, his general that he placed there has troops to defend it, but for some reason he refuses to attack and actually fight off the Russians, which
this
makes
is the Battle of K.
That happen soon. So Frederick is very furious and he sends one of his generals, Karl Heinrich von Weidel, with part of his forces to the north to actually take over the front and engage the Russians. Now, this guy is extremely aggressive. He just wants to get the Russians out. And
so is he more aggressive than Frederick?
It's hard to be more aggressive than Frederick, but he has a similar spirit, but not the talent.
That sounds very ominous.
And because of his aggressive nature, the Battle of K happens, where the Russians absolutely defeat his forces and essentially force Frederick himself to go to the north and deal with him. And
just to add to Simone about the scale of losses, Russians had about 41,000, and they are actually now led by a new general called Pyotr Saltyakov, who is going to be probably the best Russian commander of the war. He had 41,000 men, and he loses about 4,800 to 5,000 men, whereas Karl Heinrich von Wedel, his army, which was just about 27,000, suffer almost 9,000 casualties. So, that was a pretty brutal beating.
Yeah. And what would actually happen as well is that the Austrians would actually send some troops to the Russians and sort of get rid of the losses, essentially, just bringing the Russians back to their previous numbers after the Battle of K. So now Frederick himself is essentially forced to move up there, which leads then to the Battle of Kunersdorf. So originally Frederick would actually come from the south, but unbeknownst to the Russians, he would actually move around the troops and deploy his forces to the north. Now, unfortunately for Frederick, the Russian troops are still positioned in a direction that would actually face the Prussians. So they are not properly outflanked, but it's not a complete essentially. They still have the fronts of the Russians still facing the Prussians, but not as complete forces. And essentially what would happen first is that Frederick sends a part of his forces to capture the Mühleberg, which is this position to the north. You can see the furthest north position of
you could call it the left flank of the Allied armies. And just adding to a little bit to what Simone has mentioned, as you can see on the map here, there is a large contingent of Austrians under General Daun. And just before you get into the details, Simone, I'll just, for the audience's benefit, just mention that it's estimated Frederick had just under 51,000 men with 230 guns. Combined Austro-Russian army is around 60,000 men. And in this case, almost 18,000 are 18 to 90,000 are from the Austrian army. So it's a pretty large Austrian contingent. It's not like a token contingent. But Simone, just back to you.
Yeah. So as you said, Frederick's actually heavily outnumbered in this situation. Now he actually his crew actually managed to capture the Mühleberg, and take position there. And some of these generals actually go to Frederick and tell him, okay, we have defeated the Russians to the north. A further attack is too risky. They heavily outnumber us. We need to retreat. But Frederick, unfortunately, is once again too stubborn and too focused to force an engagement. And so he decides to move further down into this region, which is called the Kuhgrund, where in the meantime, the Russians have actually formed up more of their troops and have formed a proper line to face the Prussians.
And I think just adding to that, a larger chunk of the Prussian army has been engaged in fighting, whereas the Russian and Austrians have not really committed as much of a percentage of their troops.
Yeah. So now essentially most of the Prussian army is fighting the Russians, but the Russians have only like half of their actual troops fighting. And now this fighting on the Kuhgrund actually turns into a real slugging match. The Russians keep sending reinforcements and plugging essentially the holes that they get from the Prussians. And this goes on for a long time. And at some point, Frederick's troops are just exhausted. They cannot fight further, and the Russians keep on coming, and the exhausted troops are switched out with new ones, while the Prussian troops are fighting non-stop. And slowly,
you could call it the break.
Yeah. So at some point, it actually goes so far that the Russian troops cannot fight further. They have been fighting the entire day and are just exhausted.
Yeah, because apparently no one is Superman, right?
Yeah. And this essentially causes the Russians to push back Frederick, and at some point he is forced to admit that this battle will not be the victory he wants, and retreats. And this is actually the entire attack on the Kuhgrund was a blunder by Frederick. If he had just retreated when he took the Mühleberg, he would essentially have caused the Russians major damage without having any casualties of his own. But thanks to...
This was the one... Sorry. Yeah, you just finished.
But thanks to his further attacking, the losses at the end actually come out fairly similar.
And this is like the one battle where the Prussian infantry completely routed, though. To be fair, the quality of the soldiers now is depleted because a lot of the veterans that made the Prussian infantry the elites are now dead or wounded. This is a recruit army because all of them are now in the phases of conscription. So the quality of the troops has gone down. And Frederick was actually pretty close to being killed in this battle. A bullet actually did hit him, but was stopped by his silver tobacco case. I guess one of my friends who really loves his smokes will just probably not want, if he hears us, he'll just say, this is a good idea for me to want to start consuming cigs. But if we get to the details of the losses, Frederick lost a lot. His army completely scattered after the battle, and it's estimated he took over 20,000 casualties in this battle. 20,000, that's over 40% of his army. Allied forces here, which was about 60,000, was estimated to be about 16,000 in total. They took far fewer casualties in comparison to the Prussians, with definitely more troops available to them. And the Cossacks decided to show why they were so brutal after the battle, plundering and devastating, because that's, well, pretty much what Cossacks can do only.
They understand their job very well.
Very well. Definitely. And this was a massive blow for the Prussian cavalry because 60% of the Prussian cavalry was destroyed that engaged were destroyed in this battle. they lost almost 200 cannons as well. Those are not really losses that are easily replaced. It takes a lot of time. And this definitely would have pushed, like everything together. And, they were still wary, but this kind of like solidified the Russian and Austrian alliance, because this was definitely a battle where the two commanders did fight together. Saltykov was actually promoted to General Field Marshal, and Empress Elizabeth also sent a sword of honor to Daun. And I think the biggest credit you'll have to just give Frederick for this battle was within a week or so after the battle, he managed to regroup his scattered army to form at least a cohesive fighting force. Somehow he just manages to do it, but the enemies do not pursue him. And this is going to be the limit, you could say, of how far the Russians will ever be able to influence in this war. Because even though Elizabeth has now publicly stated that she's going to continue supporting them, they are really just at the limits of the supplies. So the effectiveness of the Russians at this range versus like where if they were closer to East Prussia, big difference.
Yeah, and one of the main hopes that they actually have would be that they could link up with the Austrians and kind of use their supplies to supplement the issues that they would have.
Yeah, and I think with that, we're going to switch theaters, because France has decided to do their first planned invasion of Britain. And this is the brainchild of what you could call the newest prime minister, which was the Duke of Choiseul, Francois de Choiseul. So I'm sorry, I can't pronounce his full name, so I'm just going to call him the Duke of Choiseul. He's at the turn of 1759 was, you could call him the effective prime minister of France right now. And he wanted to launch an great bold attack that would knock Great Britain out of the war in one particular go. Yep, that's it. His great attack was that. And this is primarily because by now, as you mentioned, Greg, the British are kind of pushing back the Nouvelle France quite decisively in North America. So this is an insult to the French, and their whole strategy represented on them gaining enough ground in the European theater of operations to barter away the colonies. And he wanted to launch a double attack against Britain and Hanover. So he was interested in the invasion of Britain, and he said that if a large French army crossed the channel without being intercepted by the Royal Navy, boom, we won the war. The only problem was his planning honestly makes me think of Operation Sea Lion. Because he believed that he just needs favorable winds and flat barges to cross the English Channel. And hear this, without any French naval warships involved to cover against the Royal Navy. Yep. Very great idea. At least I want to say, thank God Napoleon at least envisioned having the French Navy at least unite for a temporary numerical advantage to allow the crossing to take place. Because this guy's idea was literally to float 100,000 soldiers across the 50-60 kilometers of the English Channel.
At least he didn't order them logistics. At least he didn't order them to swim across. That's
because this guy believed that if you got warships involved, it'll be the same fate of the Spanish Armada. And the concept was literally just go by boats, as I mentioned.
These guys, and if they made it to Britain, are they going to live off the land? Like, how's that going to work?
The thing is, he believed that Britain will have absolutely no troops enough to fight, because apparently, I guess, the local people are just supposed to fold without any resistance. But he got this plan approved and passed through the French cabinet. And this was going to be one of the two major offensives that the French would mount, with the other being a battle against Hanover as well, which we'll also get to. And France also tried to consider starting a Jacobite rebellion in England again and tried to get Russia and Denmark to provide troops and naval stores for the expedition. The only thing they got was Sweden considering sending a scouting force to Scotland. That was pretty much the only support they got for their. Yeah, just don't want to ever ask about the French and their invasion plans. And the problem is, he decides the British are not as fractious as he also assumes, because the British spies, like the type of the Spanish Armada, was so well informed. And William Pitt and the Duke of Newcastle had already decided to put their personal differences aside, and Britain was now fighting a cohesive European and global war from a political strategy point of view. So that was a big plus for them. And they also began to raise around new troops to support the 10,000 regulars that were to be maintained. And the British, under Admiral Sir Edward Hawke, decided to put a blockade around the French ports. So that the French, they literally spent 30 million livres on the construction of these barges. And by midsummer, it's estimated that they only have 325 transports for 50,000 soldiers. But it's kind of short of what the Duke had sold them on. And despite opposition, the Choiseul still is not wanting to take any French naval military support. I just don't know what this guy was on. Must have been the good stuff, I guess.
Hermann Göring being like, let's just drop 100,000 German paratroopers into Britain. And that's it. Nothing else.
Yeah. And to top it off, he's now agreed that instead of landing the 100,000, we're going to also send 20,000 more soldiers on barges to Scotland to support a Jacobite uprising. Just
wow.
This guy's, yeah. So the British react. So you have they know about this plan. So there is first a small raid by Admiral George Rodney, where they attack one of the preparation ports of Le Havre, and it's a small success. You could call it like similar to Francis Drake saying singeing of the King of Spain's beard. It just set back the operation a little bit, but destroyed some transports and everything, but nothing really crippling. So it's not really worth mentioning, but it did push the invasion launch date back a bit. And this is actually where opposition starts to mount up, because the further you push back an invasion, especially in the time of Age of Sail, when you're approaching winter, that's not really a good thing for anyone to be considering. Then in August of 1759, the British engaged the French at one of two naval battles that are about to take place. Yep. One sec, I'm just bringing up a map because where the battle takes place. Yeah. It was also it's a bit relevant because one, this is close to where Trafalgar also takes place a few decades later. And second, it's also where Portugal is going to somewhat be involved in the war, but I'll get to that in a bit. We have the Battle of Lagos. And in this, we have, the French fleet from Toulon under Admiral Leclerc. They slip the blockade and go out through the Straits of Gibraltar, and are intercepted by a British fleet led by Admiral of the Blue Edward Boaskin. It's 15 ships of the line of the British Mediterranean fleet that are intercepting them with 10 frigates, whereas the French have 12 ships of the line and 3 frigates. And, during the battle, 8 of the French ships actually just decide that they are going to continue to Cadiz. And this is interpreted because apparently they saw a change of course from the flagship of the Admiral Leclerc. So the French, most of the French fleet just decides not to engage. Well, French and naval attacks never seem to really work out. And we have the British, several French ships engaged because the French are covering the slowest moving ship, which is the Hanoverian, and the British, begin to attack and defeat the French in detail in this battle. The British casualties are very light: 56 killed, 196 wounded. The French have 500 casualties, but this is where the casualties really mount up. 3 of the 12 ships of the line are captured and 2 are destroyed. So it's a bit of a blow, considering the British have absolutely no hull losses. And next we have the more decisive Battle of Quiberon Bay. And this is a pretty decisive battle for British history, because this is where you could say the Royal Navy takes over the title of the number one navy in the world, a position that is going to hold unchallenged for 200 years. And this battle, what we see is the French arrive and are intercepted again by a British fleet. And this is where the admiral of the French, right, Admiral de Bruyne, sailed from Brest, heading down to Quiberon Bay, which is where the invasion army was supposed to board its transports and head to Britain. And because the invasion has now been pushed back, an Atlantic storm blew in and delayed the French fleet by a few days, which allowed the British to catch up. And when that took place, the British under Admiral Sir Edward Hawke, engaged. We are talking about fairly equal size, but the British have a bit of a numerical advantage. They have 24 ships of the lines with 5 frigates versus 21 ships of the lines and 6 frigates. So it's not really Nelsonic epicness in terms of being outnumbered, but having better crews. I guess Britain can't win it all like that, I guess. And initially, at the start of the battle, the French were formed into the line of battle, preparing to engage. And as usual, at the last minute, the French admiral changes his mind, and well, he decides that they need to take shelter in the bay. And Admiral Hawke took a high risk pursuit in the middle of a storm and captured a drove aboard 5 ships with no losses, with 2 of his own ships running aground but would later be recovered. And this battle just put an end to any threat of an invasion for the British on their main line. But yeah, this was the great ideas of the French, that they can invade Britain and get away with it.
Honestly, it was probably a good thing for them. I can't imagine how this would have gone down if they tried to get the barges out there.
At least sea lion seemed relatively a better idea than what these guys concocted.
Yeah.
But if it would have happened, that would be absolutely legendary.
Yes.
If. Because like, land generals need to remember one thing: they're not crossing a river. But maybe I think we should head back to the main theater, because I think, Simone, we could talk about Frederick's recovery. Because now it's the year 1760, because after the Battle of Kunersdorf, there are no real major engagements in the Silesian and Saxon theaters. Since, as we mentioned, the Russians are at the edge of their supplies, and both sides, you could say, despite that initial jubilation at beating Frederick, they do not really get along with each other.
Yeah, essentially, actually, the Russians sort of want to retreat to their winter quarters again in Poland, but the Austrian and Russian empresses both say that, no, you're gonna work together and you're gonna combine. And that is essentially what they try. And during that time, now there happened 2 battles. The Battle of Maxen, which is like an attack where Frederick tries to attack the supply lines of the Austrians, which doesn't go well, because every time Frederick splits off parts of his army, you can imagine it's going to be an absolute disaster. Essentially,
it's not like he has many troops left.
Yeah, this force gets surrounded and defeated. And the second battle that happens is the Battle of Landshut. Well, happens in Silesia, where Frederick essentially orders another split of part of his army and tells them to hold the fortress city of Landshut. But once again, something very similar happens. A isolated part of his army gets surrounded and essentially attacked. So as you can see,
and this was just continue.
Yes. So as you can see on this map, the Austrians are just surrounding them, and the Prussians are essentially holding a line in the center. Well, in the middle of them, they have the fortress city of Landshut itself, and both to the south, southwest, and northeast, they have further troops, and they're both of the flanks.
And this was actually a big loss because the Austrians suffered about 3,000 casualties, whereas nearly all of the 12,000 Prussian soldiers were either killed or captured.
Yeah, because
so it's a pretty big loss.
But we're gonna keep this very brief, this battle, because what did happen is that the Austrians attacked the Prussian left flank and just pushed them down further into the fortress. They captured the fortress. All of them were surrounded. The cavalry tried to break out, but was also defeated by the Austrian cavalry. And later, when the infantry independently tried to break out, because the infantry had no idea that the cavalry was trying to break out, they were once again defeated and surrendered, with the rest of the troops that survived being captured. Now, the entire war at this point seems pretty hopeless for Frederick. He has lost battle after battle after battle, having lost essentially all of his veteran troops, and the troops he still have are inexperienced recruits and sort of the people you actually do not want to have in an army. The quality has degraded massively.
Should we just briefly also mention the Battle of Liegnitz? Things are around the same time as well. Because it was a great victory for him.
Yeah. So the Battle of Liegnitz is essentially the prelude to the next battle we're going to talk about, where essentially Frederick himself gets surrounded, in essence, where his right flank is essentially facing the main Austrian army on the Daun, and his right is facing...
You mean his left?
Yeah, his left. That's correct. His left is facing the Austrian right under... I keep...
Laudon.
Laudon, yeah. Under Laudon.
Yeah.
Now,
and
these...
Again, I was just saying, Daun is going to be Daun.
Yeah. And the communication between these two sides are actually really bad. They do not know what the other side is doing. So Laudon essentially decides to attack, and Frederick has anchored himself on this hill you can see in the center. So Laudon's troop has to charge uphill at the hunkered down Prussian army, and they absolutely get demolished. It's really hard fighting. They are shot by artillery. The Prussian infantry is constantly shooting at them. And
I think this is one of Laudon's failures, is while he was really pragmatic and a very competent and capable general, this battle he did not coordinate even his own forces.
Yeah.
Daun's bulk of the 50 to 55,000 soldiers that we see here, right? Where on this map where we see Daun, Waldau, Lacy's troops, they never engage. It's only Laudon's 25,000 against the 30,000 of Frederick. Even his own infantry, artillery, and cavalry were uncoordinated. And it was a pretty big mauling for him.
He actually gets outflanked by those troops you can see between both sides of Frederick's army, and the moment he gets those flanked, his army just folds. They have been mauled by the infantry and now outflanked, and they flee. And this is actually when Daun decides, okay, I'm going to move up my army and try to fight him. He actually managed to deploy in time, but Daun, being Daun, decides that engage. He has deployed. That's enough. He's not going to engage, which actually allows.
Even though the yeah, I was just gonna say Frederick's troops are tired, right? They've been fighting Laudon's army, but these 55,000 are fresh. They are ready for battle, and Daun does not engage and just withdraws. But yeah, it's crazy what this guy was.
Yeah, this essentially is sort of the prelude to the next battle, which happens very shortly after.
I'll just quickly tell about the casualties. Frederick suffered about 3,400 casualties, but inflicted closer to 9,000 on Laudon's armies. I'm not even going to call it the Austrian army. I'm just saying Laudon's armies for a reason, because at least that guy fights. I'll just switch over to the next battle.
So the next battle is, as you can see, very different, because for one time it's actually not Frederick that gets more or less ambushed. Essentially, Frederick manages to move around the armies of Daun, who has camped in this it's kind of gorge or some
to the west of the city of Torgau.
And Frederick sends parts of his army under Zieten to surround them from the south, while he and the main portion of his army is moving to the north to create a pincer movement. Daun actually realizes this, and he essentially takes his rear line, his second line, and turns them around so he can fight on two sides at the same time.
Can I just add this fact that it was a pretty large battle, over 100,000 troops on both sides. Frederick had 48,000 to 49,000 men, and Daun had over 52,000 men. What I think I find most interesting or such is the number of artillery pieces. The Austrians had 275 cannons at this battle. Frederick had almost 310.
Yeah, it was actually that while the infantry was keep getting worse and worse, the artillery was getting increased at the same time. Because if you lack people, you really do not need as many people for devastating effect as the infantry needs.
That is actually one of his smart financial decisions, you could call it, because as Simone mentioned, the quality of the Prussian troops are going down. So because of casualties and attrition, the Prussians had way more guns. Because if you remember in our early battles, he was always outgunned by 2-1 or 3-1 margin in the number of guns available. Simone, would you like to continue about Torgau?
Yeah. So what happens now is that Frederick himself begins an attack, and he essentially fights the now second line or the rear line of the Austrians, and this is just heavy fighting there. Zieten actually at the same time does not attack, because the communications between these two sides is very sparse, and they do not coordinate very well. So Daun can actually focus a lot of his troops to the north, and manages to hold up Frederick, at least for a time.
I was also going to add to the fact that because Zieten did not attack, and Frederick attacked because he believed Zieten was under attack, Daun, being better apprised of the tactical situation, actually concentrated a lot of his cannons. And Frederick's half of the army, you could say, took 5,000 casualties in a very short period of time.
Yeah. But at some point, Zieten actually now managed to attack, which completed the pincer, and Daun now fighting on both sides of his troops and facing to get outflanked, and he actually would get outflanked from the west by parts of a cavalry charge, realizes that his position is untenable, and he decides to retreat to the east.
And
now, despite
this was a Prussian victory.
Yeah, despite Prussia surrounding the Austrians and they considering victory, the casualties for the Prussians were actually really high. At the first, Frederick considered this a great victory, but later when he received how many troops he has actually lost, he reconsidered and was not that excited anymore.
It's definitely a Pyrrhic victory, I would call it.
Yeah.
That he lost almost more than a third of his army. The Prussians did admit to casualties of 16,670 men. And they acknowledged also that the Austrians suffered just under 15,900 casualties. Consider the fact the Austrians had a slight numerical advantage in this battle. It wasn't 4,000 in these kind of battles is not a decisive factor in the numbers, but they still took fewer casualties on a larger base. So. And I'd also add that both Frederick and Daun were actually injured in this battle.
Yeah, it is even stated that Frederick was so heavily injured that he lost consciousness several times.
Yeah, and this was, I think, where we will be ending this episode, because this does mark to the end of most of the 1760 campaign. We still have some pretty big battles to come, and our favorite cuck of the world will be joining us in the next battle, and I'm just so waiting to talk about Peter III of Russia. We'll try to conclude this episode definitely in the next one.
For the European theater.
We are going to see expansion of the war as 2 new combatants are going to be joining in.
Well, all right. Would you say that this at least increased morale for the Prussians as they were, suffering a string of defeats?
I think a Pyrrhic victory does not do... I think it makes it worse than a defeat.
Yeah.
And you also have to keep in mind, these troops know that they have been fighting for years. They are absolutely exhausted. This has long since been it's been a thing of the past for several years now, or that there were decisive battles and anyone had any hopes of winning this in a real manner. And at this point, I think the troops have realized that as well.
Yeah. Well, we're cutting it off there, folks. But, before I leave the audience, another reminder, please check us out on YouTube so you know kind of what we're talking about when we're referring to all these maps and that. It's easier with the visual components, I have to say. And again, if you'd like to further support us, please consider checking out the YouTube membership or the Patreon account at www.patreon.com/Pacific War Channel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, which is about 33 episodes and ongoing. You also get early access to all the content I make and voting rights for subjects that I will tackle next. Thank you again to my 2 guests, Gaurav and Simone. This is an extensive and very difficult war to go through, to say the least. And I know that the audience likes it because, the views, the downloads for the audio only doubled. And noticeably on YouTube, this is certainly one of the better performing episodes. So definitely this is a crowd pleaser. I'm hoping that when this is all bundled up into probably a 10-hour long podcast, they'll like that. And I'm going to try and edit it.
I'm actually going to think it might be a bit longer.
Yeah, maybe. And that includes the French and Indian War and the India theater as well, which I will have to figure out where I'll place it all, because it's going to be it's going to have to do a lot of editing magic for that. But it's going to make for one of the longest episodes I'll ever put out. Yeah, for sure. So staying all of that until next time.
Thanks, Craig.